On the wind-swept plains of Wyoming, where the breeze whispers like echoes of old regrets, an old man who once vowed never to love another creature suddenly rescues a starved, trembling Mustang in the heart of a snowstorm. No one knew why he did it, but that dying creature would soon pull an entire town out of its judgment and teach the old man how to live again. The wind howled through the cracks in the siding, slapping the wooden doorframe like the sudden knock of some invisible hand. Snow poured in white sheets over the rusted tin roof, and gusts slipped through the gaps, making the fire in the stove tremble as if it, too, wanted to give up. Walt Deacon sat motionless in the tiny kitchen, both hands wrapped around an old enamel mug. The coffee inside had long gone cold. No warmth left, not in the cup, not in his chest. The wall clock struck 3 with a lifeless clunk. Another sleepless night on Coyote Hill. The Deacon Ranch stood apart at the edge of the valley, tucked beneath rocky hills and crooked old pines. Since his wife passed, the only sounds in the house had been wind and the creak of old timber. Then came the noise. Not wind, not breaking branches. A thud, heavy, urgent, and full of desperation, like someone, or something, had thrown itself hard against the wooden gate out by the barn. Walt jumped to his feet, the chair screeching loud against the floor. He froze, ears straining through the wind's roar. Another sound followed, faint, choked, like the last breath of a dying creature. He grabbed the oil lamp, hands trembling as he struck the flint. The dim yellow glow flickered in the gusts. Throwing on his old brown wool coat, he yanked open the front door. A slap of wind and ice struck him like a freezing hand, blowing snow in wild swirls across the porch. Step by heavy step, his boots sank deep into slush and wet mud as he followed the fence line toward the gate. And there, it was there, a collapsed form in the mud, limbs sprawled as if no strength remained. Its head drooped, its body quivering. A horse, but barely. Caked in mud, its coat matted with blood-streaked dirt, the creature looked like something torn from a nightmare. Its back leg, swollen, twisted, so mangled he couldn't tell tendon from bone. Every time it tried to lift its head, the body shook like it would snap in two. Walt froze, his throat clamped shut. It had been years since he'd seen a wild horse, and never one that looked like this, like it had crawled straight out of hell. "Oh Lord," he whispered, dropping to his knees, one hand slowly extended. The horse flinched, tried to pull back, but couldn't. Its eyes, clouded with terror and pain, still clung to the dim glow of the oil lamp. "It's okay." Walt's voice was low, trembling but steady. "I won't hurt you." He set down the lamp and shrugged off his coat, gently wrapping it around the trembling body. Beneath the soaked fur were old scars and fresh cuts, rope burns, deep slashes, as if someone had tied this animal down and dragged it through sharp stone. Walt inhaled hard. He had sworn off animals, sworn it the day Linda, his wife, was thrown from a Mustang and never came home. But he couldn't walk away, not when this creature was dying on his doorstep. He tied the horse loosely to a board, then ran back into the house. He grabbed old blankets, a coil of rope, and the largest pot he had. The storm screamed in protest, but Walt didn't stop. The old barn still smelled of damp straw and mildew, but it was the only place out of the wind. He spread blankets on the floor, then strained to drag the horse inch by inch. It didn't fight. Maybe it couldn't. "You're alive. That's already a miracle." Walt panted as he finally settled the freezing body onto the straw. He boiled water, gently wiped the mud from its face, revealing dried blood crusted against raw skin. Its eyes stayed shut, but twitched every time the rag brushed a wound. Walt's hands were rough and shaking, but each movement was careful, patient. When he laid his palm on its forehead, the horse cracked one eye open, deep and gray like old ash, with no spark left inside. "Ashes," Walt murmured. "That's your name." He stayed beside it until the night wore thin. Outside, the wind still screamed. Snow still fell. But in that drafty wooden barn, by the wavering light of an oil lamp, a man and a wounded soul had begun to weave something fragile, thin as thread but real. The next morning, the sun didn't bother rising. Thick clouds rolled heavy over Coyote Ridge, and snow still drifted in the air like powdered chalk. Walt sat by the window, hands cradling a steaming cup of coffee, eyes fixed on the barn door out back, where the wild horse had lain still since the night before. He had risen before dawn, laid down fresh straw, boiled warm water, and brewed a mix of herbs from Linda's old wooden box, a blend she used years ago for their sheepdog when he broke his leg. Walt wasn't sure if it still worked, but the scent of mint and fennel softened the air just enough. Ashes still wouldn't eat. Still wouldn't drink. Eyes barely open, chest rising in shallow waves, as if each breath was its own battle. Walt sighed, rough hand gently resting on the horse's neck. "If you'll just open your eyes," he murmured, "I won't give up on you." By midday, a rusty old truck pulled up to the gate. The door slammed and out stepped May Ruthlin, draped in a thick fur coat and mud-specked rubber boots. "Walt Deacon," she hollered before she'd even crossed the fence. "I heard you dragged some half-dead Mustang into your barn. Tell me that's not true." Walt frowned slightly and stepped out of the barn. He didn't enjoy conversations with May. She was the kind of woman who thought the whole town revolved around her, always in everyone's business, uninvited. "Not dead," he replied, voice calm. "Still breathing." May crossed her arms and marched toward the barn. Her eyes swept over the gaunt frame, the patches of missing hair, the red swelling on Ash's leg. Her face twisted. "Good Lord, it's alive? What are you going to do with that thing, Walt? Chase ghosts?" Walt didn't answer. He pulled out a handkerchief to wipe his hands and stepped between her and the barn door. "I'm serious," May pressed on, her voice sharp. "If it were me, I'd take it out back and end it. Quick and kind. Keeping that mess is just asking for pain." A flicker of anger sparked in Walt's eyes, but he held it back. He didn't argue. Not anymore. Not with people who only talked, never listened. "Appreciate the visit," he said, opening the gate with a polite gesture to see her out. May sniffed, lifted her chin and turned on her heel. Her boots clomped across the frozen ground. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." As the truck rumbled away, Walt stood quietly by the fence. He wasn't watching May leave. His eyes had turned back toward the barn, where Ashes had just cracked one eye open. Just a sliver of light. But a sign. A soul not entirely lost. Days passed. Walt continued caring for the horse as if it were the only thing he had left. Every morning he boiled water, cleaned wounds, applied ointment, changed bandages, and laid down new straw. He didn't expect anything. Didn't tell anyone. Just Walt and Ashes in an old wooden barn under a roof that creaked in the wind. Ashes still wouldn't eat. Walt mashed grain and apples, soaked them in warm water, set the bowl near its nose. He sat beside it for hours, but the horse turned its head away. The wound began to seep, blood mixed with pus, the stench thick in the cold barn. One night, as Walt knelt to clean the front leg, Ashes suddenly flinched and kicked weakly with its back leg. Walt backed off, but didn't get angry. He had seen it, something in its eyes. A fear that had no name. On the 9th day since Ashes appeared, something strange happened. Walt was watering the back lot when he heard the creak of the barn door. He rushed over and stopped cold. A skinny, curly-haired boy was slipping inside, holding a large carrot like a sneaky cat in a kitchen. Ashes lay with its head low in the straw, eyes half open, watching the boy's every step. "Hey!" Walt barked, his voice booming. The boy flinched, dropping the carrot. "I'm sorry," he stammered. I heard you had a real Mustang. I just wanted to see it." Walt exhaled, still stern. "What's your name?" "Nate. Nate Cooper. I live with my grandma at the end of Larch Street. She says you're crazy for bringing that horse here, but I don't think so. I like horses." Walt stared at the boy, then glanced at Ashes. The horse didn't move, but its ears twitched. "You want to look? Then stand still. Don't touch it." Nate nodded rapidly. "I know how to talk to horses, Mr. Deacon. My mom taught me." Walt didn't answer, but he didn't tell the boy to leave either. Nate stood quietly by the railing for a full hour, watching. Before he left, he placed the carrot beside the water bowl and bowed his head in thanks. The next day, the carrot was gone. No one saw Ashes eat it. But the dirt there was freshly pressed, the straw shuffled, as if the horse had moved. Walt didn't comment. He simply left another carrot. And the next day, it vanished too. Nate began visiting every afternoon after school, always bringing vegetables or fruit. He sat by the fence and read aloud what he'd learned in class. Walt didn't stop him. He began to notice something. The horse, somehow, was hearing what he himself couldn't say aloud. One evening, when the cold was sharp enough to freeze the water in the trough, Walt brought extra blankets to the barn. As he knelt to straighten the bedding, something unexpected happened. Ashes lifted its head, slowly, and looked him straight in the eye. Not the hazy, terrified stare from before. but a gaze, tired, trembling, but alive, as if asking, "Are you really staying?" Walt didn't look away. He gently laid a hand on its forehead and whispered, "I'm here. As long as you're breathing, I'm here." Ashes didn't flinch, for the first time. That night, Walt stayed up until morning, not because of worry, but because, for the first time in years, something inside him had begun to stir again. Not quite hope, not exactly love, but life. The snow had begun to melt, but the soil of Coyote Hill remained frozen, like a wound that refused to heal. The nightly storms had eased, but the wind still slipped through the pine trees like a whisper from the past, always there, waiting to rise again. Ashes had started to eat. First, the apple slices Nate left behind, then soft oats soaked in warm mash. Every morning, Walt watched as the broken body began its slow resurrection. Each mouthful a quiet victory. Every step, every tilt of the head was a battle won. The swelling in the hind leg had gone down slightly, but the horse still dragged its gait, its left leg trailing behind with a painful, creaking scrape. Walt massaged the limb daily, changed the bandages as carefully as he once had with his own hands after they'd been torn open by barbed wire years ago. The difference was, his hands healed. Ash's leg hadn't. One morning, while cleaning the back of the leg, Walt's fingers brushed over something odd, a groove that didn't belong. He narrowed his eyes, pulled the lamp closer. It was a clean line, sharp, encircling, tight. Not a bruise, not a random cut, wire, a deep groove where a rope or barbed wire had once dug in, biting into flesh. A vein popped at Walt's temple. He wasn't the kind to rage out loud. His kind of fury didn't need shouting or smashing. It only needed a hard stare and a fist clenched so tight the knuckles turned white. Someone had tied this horse down, dragged it, beaten it, left it to die in a storm. He let the gauze fall from his hand and sank down beside the stall, back against the wooden post. Chest heaving, not from exhaustion but from the weight of fury that had no outlet. He wasn't a sheriff, had no proof, but he knew this kind of cruelty. He'd seen it, on his wife's back, on the corpse of an abandoned cow. And now, it stood here, in his barn, under his care, with eyes too tired to even hold anger. That afternoon, Walt drove into town to buy more feed and bandages. As he stepped into Ruthland's general store, May looked up from the counter with her usual smirk. "Heard your horse is walking now. Great, hope it walks right on out." Walt said nothing. Another customer chimed in. "That wild thing should have been put down from the start. I heard it broke someone's leg." Walt laid a sack of oats on the counter, his voice low and flat. "It didn't break anything, but someone sure broke it." May waved her hand. "You don't know a thing. Mustangs are all crazy. Wild animals not meant to live near people. Didn't you lose your wife to one?" That sentence sliced clean through the store. Everything went still. Walt didn't reply. He pulled out his money, nodded once, and walked out without looking back. When he got home, he found Nate standing outside the barn with a brush in hand. "I'm sorry," the boy said. "I just wanted to groom her a little." Walt stepped closer and rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "She let you?" Nate nodded. She didn't flinch, but her eyes looked sad. Walt peered into the stall. Ashes stood still, head low, ears twitching, like it was still listening to every word. "Nate," Walt said softly, "you ever hear of Tomas Vidal?" The boy's eyes lit up. "He's the trainer from Texas. He had that horse, Blue Comet. Won 3 years in a row. I read about him in a magazine. He lives about 10 miles from here, little cabin at the end of Juniper Ridge. Nobody talks to him these days. But if anyone knows horses, it's him." Nate's mouth fell open. "You're going to ask him for help?" Walt nodded. "You want to come with me?" The next day, they went. A creaky old pickup groaned up the red dirt hills. After the third bend, they reached the cabin tucked deep in the woods, weathered, silent, covered in pine needles and the weight of time. Tomas Vidal appeared on the porch like he'd been waiting all along. Sun-darkened skin, shoulder-length silver hair, eyes deep and brown like polished walnut. He didn't ask who they were. Just looked straight at Walt. "The man who swore off saddles," Tomas said, "now comes to me over a Mustang. That's a story." Walt stepped up one worn wooden stair. "I'm not here for me. I'm here for her." Tomas nodded once. "Show me." Ashes stood in the stall, front leg bent, hindquarters still swollen. But her eyes were open, watching like she knew this new presence might determine her fate. Tomas didn't step inside. He stood just outside the rail, removed his gloves, and raised his hand, fingers splayed like a bird's wing. He said nothing. Ashes lifted her head. Her ears swiveled toward him. And then, something no one expected. She took a step, slow, measured, and another. She stopped at the edge of the stall, nose gently brushing against his open palm. Nate held his breath. Tomas closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, his voice was soft as fallen leaves. "She's not crazy." "Then what is she?" Walt asked. "Betrayed." They sat around an old table, sunlight cutting through dusty windows. Tomas spoke of trauma in wild horses, how creatures born for freedom were broken, reshaped, and tossed away like junk. He told them of a horse he'd once trained, also bound and dragged for miles. "Took me 2 years before she let me touch her ears," he said with a bitter smile. "And then?" Nate asked. "She won that year's race," Tomas replied. "Not because she was fastest, but because she didn't quit." He turned to Walt. "I can help Ashes, but you have to stay, and not just teach her to run, you have to relearn how to trust." Walt fell into a long silence. "Horses," he finally said. "I understand. Trust, maybe that's something I need to learn all over again." And so the training began. No whips, no saddles, only breath, eye contact, distance, patience. Tomas called it the language before language, something humans had forgotten, but horses never had. Walt stood at the edge of the training pen. His hands trembled as Ashes circled around him. No reins, no commands. Only the fragile thread of trust, recently reborn. Nate sat on the fence rail, clutching a rope he'd braided from old yarn. In his eyes, a small flame had sparked, and in Walt's heart, a question had started to form. Could this horse run again? But deeper still, a harder question. Could he open his heart again? Morning on the Coyote Plains came wrapped in thick mist like smoke from a fire long gone. Cold wind slipped through the wooden fence rails, lifting fine dust into the air. The sky hung dull and gray, offering no light. And yet, beneath that heavy sky, a man and a horse were learning to believe in something beyond themselves. Ashes was standing on her own now. Her hind legs still limped, but her first few steps on the mulch-covered training ground no longer dragged like before. Walt stood 10 paces away, hands in his coat pockets, gaze steady, but never too direct, just as Tomas had instructed. "Don't threaten, don't persuade, just let her see you," Tomas had said. From afar, Tomas Vidal watched from a broken-legged wooden chair, an unlit pipe in his hand. "This is how it starts," he said. "Not with orders, with presence. Not control, but consent." Ashes turned her head toward Walt. Her eyes were still as deep and dark as the name he'd given her, but something in them had shifted. She sniffed the air, then took one step forward, just one. Then stopped. Walt didn't move. The wind caught the edge of his coat, rustling it gently, as if even a single wrong gesture might undo what had just been built. Tomas nodded. "That's enough for today." The following days became a rhythm of quiet persistence. Mornings were for walking circles around the pen, no rope, no saddle. Afternoons were for brushing, hoof cleaning, and massaging tired muscles still aching from old wounds. Evenings were spent by the fence with Nate, yet listening as Tomas taught them to hear a horse's breath. "Every snort, every twitch of an ear is a sentence," Tomas explained. "If you can't understand her words, don't expect her to understand yours." Walt had once been a Marine. He understood maps, codes, whistles in the night. But this silent language, made of breath and blinks and weight shifts, was the first tongue he'd had to relearn from scratch. One early spring afternoon, Nate brought a yellow flyer from town. The headline shouted in bold letters, "Annual Coyote Hill Spring Race, sign up now." He handed it to Walt, eyes sparkling like fireworks. "Mr. Walt, let's enter Ashes. I'll paint a sign that says Team Ashes." Walt glanced at the flyer. 5-mile loop around Clover Ridge, open to registered local ranch horses. He folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket, shaking his head. "No." "But why?" Nate protested. "She's walking, she's running, you've seen her do every drill." Walt looked at the boy. His voice was calm, but there was a shadow in it. "It's not that she can't. I'm just not sure I should." That night, with the wind shifting from the west, Walt stood alone by the barn. Ashes lay curled in the straw, eyes half closed. Nearby, an old worn saddle strap hung from a peg, brought by Tomas from some dusty corner of his cabin. "You should let her choose," Tomas had said earlier that day. "No one's forcing anything, but if she's ready, you'll know." Walt turned to leave when he heard the barn door creak open. Ashes was standing there, unrestrained, no one leading her. The wind tousled her white-tipped mane. She looked at him, then stepped forward. 1 step, 2, 3. She reached the old strap and nudged it with her muzzle. Walt froze, not in surprise, but in something deeper. Linda, his late wife, had once had a horse like that. One day it touched the saddle hanging on the wall. The next she rode and never came back. Walt bent down, picked up the strap, held it tight. "All right," he whispered. "You chose. Then I won't walk away." The first ride with Tack happened in the training ring. Tomas tied a safety line to a central post just in case Ashes spooked or bucked. But there was no bucking, no panic, only trembling legs, wide eyes, and a brave, quiet acceptance. Walt stood beside her, voice hoarse. "Don't let the past win." Ashes reached forward, gently bit the leather rein. Tomas chuckled low. "She gets it. Trust me." 1 week later, Walt mounted Ashes for the first time. No one spoke. Nate held a camera, hands shaking like he'd witnessed a miracle. Tomas stood with arms folded, eyes locked on the pair. Walt gripped the reins, easing his weight forward. Ashes stepped back once, then stilled. Walt found his balance, heart pounding so loud he thought the whole pen could hear it. "We try again," he whispered. "This time together." Ashes pushed off slowly. 1 loop, then 2. No words. But when they stopped, Walt's eyes were red. He leaned forward, pressed his forehead to her neck. "Thank you." That evening, Nate ran through town with a race form in hand. He filled it out himself. Horse, Ashes. Rider, Walt Deacon. He gave it to Walt without a word, just held it up like a solemn vow. Walt took it. He didn't smile, but he nodded. The weekend before the race, the town held its first festival meeting. On the wooden platform in front of the town hall, the mayor spoke of community, tradition, and the riders coming from nearby towns. The crowd buzzed with excitement, talking horses, Italian saddles, and expensive grain feed. Then someone noticed Walt Deacon's name on the sign-up sheet. "What? That old man's riding that lame horse?" The whole room burst into laughter. Some slapped knees, some whistled. He should enter her in a plowing contest, not a race. Walt stood at the back, silent. But behind him, Nate stood tall, eyes fixed on the ones laughing. "Go ahead and laugh," the boy said. "Come race day, you'll be standing when she crosses that line, just to clap." That night, as Walt and Ashes walked home, the wind began to howl, cold, hard, bringing the scent of rain and desert dust from the south. A reminder, the road ahead would not be easy. But Walt no longer feared it, because now he didn't walk it alone. The April wind swept across the barren hills, carrying the scent of fresh grass and red dust from the winding trails. Coyote Hill was stirring. The snow was gone, but the ground bore marks like faint scars, reminders of something that once burned and slowly healed. And among those scars, a horse was running. Not on 4 strong legs, but on 3 steady ones and one still learning, driven by a heart that refused to quit. Ashes, the same horse dragged in half-dead from a snowstorm, now galloped under the fading light of dusk. Her hooves struck the ground in an uneven rhythm, thud, scuff, like a soft drumbeat echoing across the plains. It wasn't the sound of speed. It was the sound of faith. Step by step, she pushed through pain, closer to something no one dared expect. Walt Deacon was no longer the man standing behind a fence with doubts in his eyes. He rode Ashes each evening, not to control her, but to move with her. The two of them, once broken pieces, were slowly mending into something whole. Not perfect, but real. Tomas Vidal, as always, sat beneath the cottonwood tree, arms folded, watching every stride. He said little these days. The teachings were no longer spoken. They lived in the way Walt breathed, the way Ashes moved, the silence between them. "The saddle's not for control," Tomas had once said. "It's for balance. If you lose faith, she'll fall. If she falls, you won't stay upright either." Walt carried those words with every breath, every shift of weight, as Ashes picked up speed. Her back leg still lagged, but somehow the muscles around it had begun to strengthen. Her body was adapting, finding new balance over old wounds. One morning, before the sun had fully crested the ridge, Walt walked to the barn earlier than usual. In his hands, he carried something he hadn't touched in years. The old wool scarf Linda had knitted for him, tucked away in a wooden chest since the day she died. He didn't know why he brought it out. Just that. The wind whispered something, and he listened. Ashes was already awake, standing tall, ears perked at the sound of boots in the straw. When she saw him, she stretched her neck and let out a soft nicker. Walt smiled. Morning to you too. He brushed a hand down her nose, then wrapped Linda's scarf around his own neck. Chilly out, we've got work to do. Ashes nudged him gently in return. The training ring had new posts and better fencing. Tomas had set up small obstacles, wooden beams crossed just high enough to challenge. Nothing flashy, just tests of courage and trust. Nate, as always, arrived with a hand-painted banner. Team Ashes, we don't quit. He tied it to a pine branch with extra knots, like it was a sacred flag. Ashes jumped the first hurdle, awkwardly, almost stumbling. The second? She clipped it, but recovered. The third, she cleared clean. Yes, girl, Nate yelled, fists in the air. You're doing it. Walt turned in the saddle, beaming. Not the quiet, forced smiles he used to wear. This one was full, alive, surprising even to him. Later that day, after the workout, Tomas pulled a worn scrap of cloth from his coat pocket, red with gold trim, embroidered with the figure of a galloping horse. Race flag from back in the day, he said, handing it to Walt. Nobody kept it, so I did. Walt took it, hands trembling slightly. I never thought I'd earn this again. Tomas tilted his head. You don't need to win it. Just be worthy of it. Each night, Ashes lay near the barn wall facing the door. Walt would sometimes sit beside her, back against the wood, eyes fixed on the moonlit sky beyond the window. He told her stories, of Linda, of his days in uniform, of jungle nights and distant gunfire. Ashes didn't understand, but she listened. One night, he told her everything, about the day Linda died, how he couldn't bear to look at the horse that threw her, how he sold every saddle, removed every nameplate, and vowed never to ride again. But then you showed up, he whispered, voice cracking, and I realized you didn't cause my pain. You reminded me how to live. Ashes exhaled slowly and leaned her head into his shoulder. One afternoon, they trained near the sand dunes. The sky turned gray, the wind howled. Rain started falling hard. The ground grew slick. Still, Walt and Ashes pressed on. A slip, Ashes lost her footing. Her body tilted. Walt leaned too far, he nearly fell, but Ashes stopped, just in time. She shifted, caught his weight, and held steady. Walt lay against her neck, heart pounding, not in fear but awe, both of them gasping, shaking. Tomas rushed forward, his face pale, but when he saw the scene, man and horse silent and steady, he froze, eyes misting. It's not the fall that counts, he whispered. It's how you stand back up. The night before the race, Walt sat beside the stall like always. Nate had gone home. Tomas had returned to his cabin. The plains were quiet. Moonlight bathed the barn roof in silver. Walt opened the door, stepped inside, and sat beside Ashes. No jacket tonight, just Linda's scarf. Ashes looked up, nudged his hand gently. Walt smiled, pulling the red and gold race flag from his pocket. He tied it softly around her neck. Tomorrow, he said, win or lose, I'm not letting go of the reins. Rain or shine, I'll be with you. If you stop halfway or if you fly across the finish, I'm going with you. Ashes gave a soft snort. Outside, the wind was quiet, but inside, the storm in Walt's heart had passed a long time ago. Race day came faster than Walt expected. Before the sun had fully broken over the ridge, Coyote Hill's town square was already buzzing like the county's biggest fair. Tents lined up in neat rows, horse name signs painted in shiny gold, loudspeakers echoing across dry, dusty grounds. The smell of fresh hay mixed with kettle corn and fried dough hung in the air, warm, sweet, alive. Walt sat quietly on a bench next to Ashes, his hand gently stroking the leather reins Tomas had repaired just the night before. He didn't speak. His face was weathered from mountain winds, but in his eyes burned something clear and bright, like a child's first glimpse of a carousel horse. Ashes stood beside him, calm. No twitching, no nervous shifting. She looked toward the crowd as if she somehow knew today wasn't like the others. Nate showed up wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a hand-painted shirt with a galloping horse across the chest. In his hands, a cardboard sign that read, Ashes, the heart of Coyote Hill. He taped it to the fence, then wrapped his arms around Ash's neck. You've got this, he whispered. Those other horses have fancy saddles and special feed, but you've got Walt, and Walt's got something better than all of them. Belief. Ashes snorted softly and nudged Nate's chest. He laughed. See? She gets it. Tomas approached carrying a water jug and a bundle of dried hay. He placed them gently beside Walt, eyes fixed on the ground as he said, Course is dry and wide. North turn's got gravel. Don't let her drift too close to the rails. Keep her breathing steady. Walt nodded. Appreciate it. Tomas placed a hand on Walt's shoulder. "You've come farther than I thought, Deacon, and you're not the only one." At the starting line, sleek horses gleamed like bronze statues, coats brushed to silk, hooves polished like mirrors. Their riders wore matching leather gear, boots shined, helmets sparkling with embroidered numbers and names. It looked like a cavalry parade. Then came Walt and Ashes. The crowd fell into a stunned murmur. "Is that the limping one? He's actually riding that old horse? Can it even stand straight?" But Walt said nothing. Ashes didn't flinch. They walked to the line and waited, still as stone as the loudspeaker crackled. "Riders, take your positions." The whistle tore through the air like a blade. The horses surged forward, hooves pounding dirt in a blur of dust and thunder. But Ashes and Walt didn't rush. They started slow, calm, steady. Walt held the reins light as breath. Ashes didn't lunge or chase. She moved in her own rhythm. The crowd laughed. Someone whistled sarcastically. "Going for a stroll, old man?" Tomas stood near the edge of the rail, hat in hand, eyes narrowed with focus. He said nothing, just watched every footfall, every motion, and nodded, just once. By the second lap, the front runners began to tire, having burned too hot too early. That's when Ashes found her pace. Her front legs moved in a smooth cadence, and her once injured hind leg adjusted, balancing her stride. She rounded the first bend and overtook two horses, without a single nudge from Walt. Walt leaned forward and whispered, "That's it, just like that." The wind brushed across his face, but for the first time in years he didn't hear echoes of past storms. He heard only the rhythm of hooves, the beat of the present. At the fourth curve, Ashes surged. The two lead horses began to stagger, foam spilling from their mouths. Ashes kept her breath even, weaving left, then right, slipping between them like a stream around stone. The crowd quieted, whispers spread. "That's Ashes? Wasn't she half dead a few months ago?" Then it happened. Just 100 yards from the finish line, a 12-year-old boy riding a black stallion lost control on the gravel. The horse slipped. The boy was thrown, hit the ground hard, rolled twice. No one stopped. Not a single rider, except Ashes. She slammed to a halt. Walt didn't hesitate. He dismounted, ran to the boy. The child clutched his arm, in pain but conscious. "Can you stand?" Walt asked. The boy shook his head. Ashes stepped forward, lowered her head toward them. Walt looked from the horse to the boy. "Climb up," he said. "We're finishing together." He lifted the boy into the saddle, climbed on behind him, and together, with the black horse limping beside them, they walked toward the finish line. No more laughter, no more jokes, just silence, awestruck, reverent. When Ashes' hooves touched the white stripe across the finish, the crowd erupted. Applause, cheers, chants. "Ashes, Ashes, Team Ashes." After the race, the boy was treated for a sprained arm. His horse, bruised but fine. Walt sat beside him as he whispered, "Thank you. I won't forget this." Walt placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to win. Just know when to stop for what matters more." Ashes didn't stand on the winner's podium. She didn't need to. But when the announcer read the final award, Medal of Honor for Exemplary Spirit, no one questioned whose name would be called. Ashes and Walt Deacon. Tomas wiped a tear. Nate threw himself around Ashes' leg. Even May Ruthlin, standing in the back, didn't say a word. She just nodded and walked away, quietly. Walt led Ashes home that night beneath a quiet sky. Children ran up to pet her. Adults handed over apples and oatmeal cookies. But when the barn door closed behind them, it was just the two of them again. Two souls once broken, now whole in silence. Walt removed the reins and hung them on their wooden peg. "You did it." Ashes nudged his shoulder. Walt sat down, leaned against the stall wall, eyes turned toward the deep black sky outside the window. "We didn't ride to win," he whispered. "We rode to live again." Outside, the wind kept moving. But in here, a man's heart and a horse's spirit had stopped running from anything. Summer came with the scent of wildflowers blooming across the hills. Coyote Hill stirred like it was waking from a long, restless sleep. People no longer spoke of the March storm. Instead, they told the story of a spring race, where a horse once found dying in the mud crossed a finish line and stepped into the town's heart. Ashes became part of daily life. Not a celebrity, not a spectacle. Just a quiet companion. She pulled Mrs. Ruthlin's cart on Sunday mornings. She hauled firewood for the church, carried laughing children behind her as if they were her personal parade. As for Walt, he didn't look much different. Still wore the same faded shirts, the same wide-brimmed hat, the same worn boots. But in his eyes now lived a steady light, the kind only seen in someone who had fallen all the way down and learned how to rise again. 1 week after the race, a wooden sculpture was erected outside Ruthland's general store. It wasn't big. It wasn't polished, just a man beside a horse with its head bowed. No plaque, no inscription. But no one needed to ask who it was. Nate was the first to lay a bouquet of wildflowers at its base. Tied to the stems was a purple note, handwritten in block letters. You don't have to win. You just have to believe. Tomas came later. He didn't bring flowers, just the red and gold race flag. He folded it carefully, placed it at the statue's feet, and walked away without saying a word. From then on, Nate came to Walt's ranch every afternoon. No need to ask. He'd pedal his bike up the gravel path, park it by the barn, and head straight into the feed room, helping scrub buckets, mix mash, spread hay. Walt never asked for help. But for the first time in his life, he allowed someone in. "You're my right hand now, kid," Walt said one evening as they replaced Ash's horseshoe. "But don't expect a paycheck." Nate grinned. "I don't want one. Long as I get to ride along when she hauls lumber, I'm good." Ashes let out a soft whinny like she agreed. One day, Walt led Ashes up the West Ridge, where all of Coyote Hill lay spread beneath them. The sky was crystal clear, the sunlight laying gold over every patch of green. Ashes stood still, eyes scanning the distance. Walt placed a hand on her neck. "You know," he said, voice rough and low, "I used to think my life ended when Linda died. I walked like a shadow. I breathed, but I wasn't living. I smiled, but I didn't feel joy. And then you showed up." Ashes took in a deep breath, her tail brushing gently against his leg. "I lost a lot before I figured out some pain never leaves, but you can learn to carry it, gently, day by day." The day Mrs. Ruthland came to the barn surprised everyone. She held a sack of oat cookies and stood at the gate, tapping it 3 times, an unspoken language older than anyone could remember. Ashes stepped forward. Not fast, but not hesitant. "I'm sorry," May said, eyes on the ground. "I was wrong. She's not a monster. She's a miracle." Walt only nodded. He didn't need her apology, just needed people to see what he'd seen all along. At the town's annual remembrance ceremony, the mayor made an unexpected announcement. They would name the open pasture behind the town hall Ash's Meadow, a space where townsfolk could bring horses to roam free. No saddles, no reins, just trust. Walt sat in the back row, hat pulled low. But when the crowd turned and started clapping, calling, "Walt, Walt, Ashes," he couldn't hide anymore. Ashes stood beside him. No lead rope, no commands. Walt rose, laid a hand on her shoulder. Together they walked toward the stage. And the whole town knew the miracle wasn't a myth. It was real. Summer passed quietly. No more races, no more trophies, just days filled with meaning. Ashes still walked the streets, pulling carts, carrying notes, letting kids braid her mane. Walt read letters to Mrs. Smith, the blind widow. He patched saddles for Lucas. He taught Nate how to tell a healthy hoof from a cracked one. They didn't need applause. They had something better. Respect from people who had once laughed and now offered thanks. One crisp autumn afternoon, with gold leaves falling around the barn, Walt sat beneath an old maple tree, watching the hills turn amber. Ashes grazed nearby, occasionally raising her head to check on him. He spoke softly, unsure if to her or himself. "You didn't just save me from loneliness. You taught me how to come alive again. You taught me to forgive others, horses, and myself." Ashes walked over, slowly. She pressed her muzzle to his forehead and stood by his side, quiet and sure, like an old friend who never needed to speak to be understood. That night, Walt returned to the house. From the old chest, he pulled out the worn reins and Linda's knitted scarf. He hung them beside her photo, once a shrine of grief, now a small altar of peace. And so, the tale of a wild horse and a lonely man became legend in Coyote Hill. No one called Walt the strange old man anymore. No one looked at Ashes with pity. Children waved as she passed. Grown-ups told the story to their kids. That once a horse thought to be useless taught a whole town what hope looked like. The wooden monument still stands, no name, no need. Because sometimes, the most beautiful stories don't need a title. They only need to be remembered. If you believe that sometimes a horse doesn't just carry wounds, but brings miracles into a human life, leave a 1 below. If you've ever witnessed a moment of connection between a person and an animal that stayed with you, comment 0. And if Walt and Ash's journey brought a lump to your throat, subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next story, where trust, life, and love are always told through the eyes of those who can never be tamed.